Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the event Global Biodiversity Targets, Which Role for Agriculture? This event is co-organized by the International Union for Conservation of Nature, together with the Nature Conservancy in the context of the Forum for the Future of Agriculture. And please note that this event is being recorded. My name is Alberto Arroyo Snell. I am from IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature. We are the most recent strategic partner of the Forum for the Future of Agriculture. And this is because we are committed to dialogue, because we need this dialogue actually to solve the environmental crisis and also together with the food challenges. Now very much under the spotlight because of the Ukraine terrible situation, as you know very well. But actually, nothing should derail us from our efforts against climate change and biodiversity loss. This is not a luxury. This is not something we can do depending on other priorities. We cannot guarantee food security for us and future generations without a healthy environment to live in. There is no future for agriculture, actually, as we know, without the environment it depends on. We need healthy food. We also can't afford to waste it, and we also cannot afford to produce it unsustainably, because we need also an environmental that is healthy to live in. So to try to advance in this discussion, under our IUCN and FFA dialogue efforts that I was mentioning before between agriculture and environmental views, this session is exactly on biodiversity and agriculture, and it will explore different perspectives towards the achievement of the environmental targets in the context of the agricultural activity. We try to advance in the discussion as much as possible with these kind of events. We're also looking forward at the moment to the final approval and implementation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework that is now under preparation, as you know. It is an honor for this event to count with Noor Jafai as moderator. She is the Europe Director Global Policy and Institutional Partnerships in the Nature Conservancy. And Noor is bringing over 20 years of policy and institutional engagement experience at European, also the UK, and international level. And actually, her focus has been very much in building bridges between industries and civil society and finding policy solutions to complex challenges. Exactly what we need, Noor. But before I hand the moderation of this event to Noor, let me introduce to our keynote speaker, Ji-Jun Lee, Director of the Science, Society, and Sustainable Future Division at the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity. She's bringing also more than 20 years experience with the United Nations and 9 years of national government experience, actually helping countries in the implementation efforts towards the achievement of conservation goals. So again, spot on. Ji-Jun will set the scene, reminding us about the key role of agriculture in the context of the global biodiversity discussion. And with this, I give the floor to you, Ji-Jun. Please, thank you.
Thank you, Alberto, for your kind introduction. Let me start with my expression of my great thanks to the organizers, IUCN, the Nature Conservancy, and the European Landowners Organization for inviting CBD Secretariat. I joined this important forum from Geneva, where the global community is completing its more than 2 weeks of negotiation on the development of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, or GBF, before it will be presented at the UN Biodiversity Summit in Kunming, China, later this year. The GBF will reset our relationship with nature by guiding our efforts to reduce threats to biodiversity and ensure its conservation and sustainable use, while also meeting human need. Before the UN Biodiversity Summit in Kunming, we have only a few months to consolidate all the inputs received from parties and stakeholders to make sure that the GBF is inclusive, ambitious, and realistic. Therefore, our discussion today on the role of agriculture in the goals and targets of the Global Biodiversity Framework is very timely and encouraging. Dear experts and colleagues, healthy ecosystems are the foundation of human health, livelihood, and food security. The food and agriculture sector relies on biodiversity for important ecosystem services, such as pollination, regulating soil organisms, resilience against disturbances, and protection against natural pests and disease. Increasing agricultural biodiversity can also help increase food production. At the same time, land use change due to agricultural expansion and intensification has been identified as one of the major drivers of biodiversity loss, according to the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. Furthermore, while the value of agricultural crop production has increased approximately threefold since 1970, soil organic carbon and pollinator diversity have significantly declined globally. As such, sustainable intensification in agriculture is closely intertwined with biodiversity conservation. Ladies and gentlemen, in order to inform our discussion today, I was asked by the organizer to share some information on the proposed target of GBF relating to sustainable agriculture. As the negotiation is currently underway in Geneva, I would like to start my talk with a disclaimer that my talk does not have any prejudice whatsoever on the current negotiation that are led by parties to the CBD. I will start with proposed target 4 relating to the conservation and sustainable use of genetic diversity. This proposed target aims to enable the recovery and conservation of species and the genetic diversity of wild and domesticated species. For example, in the past century, 75% of genetic plant diversity in agriculture has been lost, according to FAO studies. And the challenge would be how we can collectively turn this trend toward the path of recovery. Proposed target 7 aims to reduce pollution from all sources to levels that are not harmful to biodiversity, ecosystem functions, and human health. This draft target proposes to reduce nutrients lost to the environment by at least half and reduce pesticide use per area of cropland by at least 2/3. Likewise, proposed target 9 aims to ensure benefits for people through the sustainable management of wild species and the protection of customary sustainable use by indigenous peoples and local communities, including benefits such as nutrition, food security, medicines, and livelihood. Perhaps one of the most directly relevant to our discussion today is the proposed target 10, which aims to ensure the sustainable management of all areas under agriculture, aquaculture, and forestry, while increasing the productivity and resilience of these production systems. One of the indicators proposed under this target is expected to measure the proportion of agricultural area under productive and sustainable agriculture. Lastly, the proposed target 16 is also very relevant as it aims to encourage responsible choices and reduce waste and overconsumption of food and other materials by at least half. For this draft target, indicators such as the food waste index and material footprint per capita are being discussed. As you can see, agriculture is included across the spectrum of various proposed targets for the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Overall, the delegates are very keen to see targets with strong commitment within the food and agriculture sector. For example, some delegates see the need to address pollinators consistently in all relevant targets. Some countries have strong views that the target should be measurable and should include numeric values, while others are concerned with the lack of capacity and financial means to implement and measure progress against these targets. Dear participants, as you can see from the intense negotiation taking place in Geneva, the development of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework is clearly a country-led process. It also benefits from the active participation of indigenous peoples and local communities, women and youth groups, business, academia, NGOs, and many other civil society groups who are making valuable contribution to this process. Such a dynamic, participatory, inclusive, and transparent process would allow us to effectively implement the 2030 action targets once adopted, which will lead us toward the achievement of the 2050 vision of living in harmony with nature. Dear panelists, I've been asked to conclude my opening remark with a set of questions for the panel. As you know, once the global biodiversity framework is adopted, the targets should be embraced at national, subnational, and local levels and across all societies. As such, my question for the panel would include, first, in your view, what would be the critical challenges for your region or countries to implement targets relating to sustainable agriculture that would transform the food and agriculture sector toward a sustainable pathway? Secondly, from the perspectives, expertise, and experience of your respective organizations, how can you help to enable such a transformation? With this, I conclude my statement and wish all of you a fruitful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mrs. Lee, for your insightful and thought-provoking comments this afternoon. Much of what you've covered reminds us just how intertwined our planet's biodiversity and capacity for food production is. And as Alberto said earlier, we need healthy nature to sustain food production for humans. And I also wish to thank you, Mrs. Lee, for posing these last two important questions that you raised. I've made a note of these, and we shall indeed address these with the panel. So thank you, Mrs. Lee, and we look forward to hearing from you hopefully again. Thank you. So now it is my pleasure and my honor to introduce our panelists for this afternoon. First, we shall hear from Mr. Janez Potočnik, who I'm almost sure needs no introduction at all. He joins us today as co-chair of UN Environment International Resource. And most of you will know the long list of contributions he's made to protect and support our environment, including in his time as the former EU Environment Commissioner. So thank you for joining us today, Janez. And then we shall hear from Mr. Ariel Brunner from BirdLife International, Senior Head of Policy for Europe and Central Asia. And many of you will also know Ariel to be very widely known and respected for actively contributing to the policy space here in Brussels for many years now. Thank you, Ariel, for joining us. And we are grateful to you for also stepping in at short notice to support your colleague, Patricia, who sadly could not make it. After Ariel, we'll then turn to Mr. Pekka Pesonen, Secretary General of COPA, European Farmers, and COPA Kejika, European Agri Cooperatives. Pekka also has a distinguished career working on the relevant policies, including his previous role as State Secretary for the Finnish Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry. Thank you, Pekka, for joining us. And last but certainly not least, we'll also be delighted to hear from Dr. Rodrigo Lima, Partner Director of Agroecone, which is very active on agriculture and renewable energy agendas relating to food, trade, and sustainable development. He has 17 years of experience on international negotiations, including at the WTO, the UNFCCC, Paris Agreement. So thank you, Rodrigo. So now we shall begin, and I'm delighted to invite Janez to start. Welcome you onto the screen.
Thank you, Nor.
Janez, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Nor. And of course, thank you for inviting me to speak to you today. The theme of how agriculture can contribute to the implementation of the next global biodiversity targets is very close to my heart. Agriculture, or to be more precise, the food system, must become central to biodiversity solutions, just as the energy sector has become central to the climate action. Together with Isabella Teixeira, I co-chair the International Resource Panel, a science policy interface in the area of resource management hosted by the UN Environment Programme. In our former roles as Brazilian Environment Minister and chairing at that time G77, and European Environment Commissioner, Isabella and I were very actively involved in CBD negotiating the Aichi targets in Nagoya in 2010. 20 biodiversity goals we committed to as a global community. The sad fact is that while we were very happy with the outcome in Nagoya, after more than a decade, none of the targets have been in reality fully met. In part, this was due to the lack of clear plans for their actual implementation. Isabella and I wanted to ensure that Kunming learns from lessons of Aichi and develops strong science-based implementation plans which address the fundamental drivers of biodiversity loss. And natural resource use is at the forefront of these drivers. IRP data shows that extraction and processing of resources is responsible for more than 90% of global biodiversity loss. And extraction of biomass alone, and we know how closely this is connected with agriculture, accounts for 80%. It is impossible to see how we can tackle biodiversity loss without improving our natural resource management. So together with Isabella, I've wrote a piece looking at biodiversity governance through a natural resource use lens, highlighting principles which can halt and reverse biodiversity loss and how they can be taken forward at Kunming to strengthen the next set of biodiversity targets. The principles are knowing your impact, planning together, growing with nature, and valuing nature. So I will very quickly talk you through them, starting with knowing your impact on nature. We can also call this value chain transparency, showing the impacts of natural resource use at every stage of the product's life cycle, from the extraction of the materials to their end use, telling you how your consumption actually impacts nature. For example, if the coffee in your cup is linked to deforestation, how much more resource intensive is the meat on your plate than an alternative protein, such as hummus or a plant-based burger. By knowing their impact, consumers, producers, investors, and policymakers will be able to choose sustainable, nature-positive models and scale them up at every step at the value chain. Progress is encouraging, but the value chain transparency to be a reality, we need a strong scientific data and consistent international standards. At COP15, ambitious countries, including the G7, can take leadership by committing to developing an agreed, science-based, standardized method for measuring the impact of consumption on biodiversity, acknowledging that, of course, COP15 will only be part of that journey. The next principle is planning together, balancing the needs of nature and people in the space available. Countries are missing the full picture of how their natural resources are being used. They need integrated strategies showing the spatial and resource needs of nature and people. Without an integrated strategy, conflicting demands will not be well balanced. For example, where should we grow forests? Which land is better suitable for which crops? And which land is really indispensable for urbanization? Having a strategy that integrates all future biomass and land needs means that decision makers can better conserve biodiversity at the same time as meeting human needs. We need governments to use science-based mapping of biodiversity and natural resource uses. This would enable competing demands to be met within the space available. Concretely, at COP15, key governance and science players could jointly commit to developing internationally agreed mapping standards based on the best possible science and to build capacity to implement inclusive spatial planning as widely as possible. This could be initiated by bringing together ambitious governments and technical and implementation experts in a standing group, working towards science-based mapping standards and comprehensive user-friendly tools. The third principle is growing with nature. Production, especially food production, can be made more sustainable through harnessing nature's inherent regenerative capacity. The role of agriculture is absolutely crucial here. What does that mean? In very simple terms, it means harnessing nature-based solutions. This could be reducing chemical fertilizers and encouraging natural soil processes or generating value from natural products. Policymakers should incentivize production, which enhances nature by redirecting financial support to regenerative agriculture and commodity production, which goes hand in hand with reforestation. Working with producers to scale this solution should be a priority. As a first step, again at Kunming, ambitious countries, including the G7, can commit to developing a set of science-based criteria for nature positivity, giving much needed clarity to governments, producers, and investors. And finally, let me end this introduction with the last principle of valuing nature. As mentioned earlier, economic systems have failed to recognize our dependence on nature. This failure is contributing to the mismanagement of natural resource use. Incentives need to change so that it makes economic sense not to destroy the biodiversity we all rely on. The Dasgupta review makes the case for changing what we mean by economic success very clear. Economic decisions could be based on an inclusive measure of wealth, factoring in human, produced, and natural capital. This would enable governments to recognize the importance of ecosystems in all their decisions. Again, as a concrete step at Kunming, countries and financial institutions can commit to working together towards the establishment of a minimum standard for natural capital accounting data. They could also collaborate for a joint capacity building initiative with countries on natural capital measurement and inclusion of nature in decision making. I hope decision makers, especially those involved in the future agriculture, will push for action on all these fronts. Probably most frequently repeated message in last years is that we have no more time to lose, but we really have no more time to lose. Thank you.
Thank you, Yanis. Thank you. And for that sobering reminder, indeed, we have no time to lose. And in the spirit of keeping to time, I'm now going to swiftly invite Ariel to join us on the virtual stage. Ariel, good afternoon to you.
Thank you very much. I think the picture has been already given by Mrs. Lee and Mr. Tocznik. And I think most people in this room knows the facts about the very rapid biodiversity loss. In the case of the EU, the massive loss of farmland birds, of butterflies, of pollinators, the bad state of agricultural habitats. The science is very clear. The science is very clear. The current agricultural model that is driving relentless intensification and relentless land clearance is wiping out biodiversity and is putting itself in question. It's very clear that our ability to feed ourselves is under threat from the combination of climate change and collapse of ecosystems. So it's clear that we need a profound change. Now, BirdLife has been arguing for a long time for this profound change, and we are working with farmers on the ground in many countries, experimenting and piloting that change. And I think that the elements of the change kind of below the sort of policy directions that were already mentioned is really down to some fairly simple things. One is about fundamental change to the way we do agriculture, to go toward what people might call regenerative agriculture or agroecology, but basically it's learning to work with rather than against nature and to reduce the use of resources in the production of food. And notice that this is not about increasing the efficiency, it's about actually reducing what we take from the planet. And this translates into things that most good agronomists would easily agree on, crop rotation, reduction in the use of nitrogen fertilizer, reduction of dependency on pesticides, biological control, looking after soil fertility, and so on and so forth. The second thing is about rebuilding biodiversity into the farmed landscape. It's what we call space for nature. Basically, a living farm needs to also have a green infrastructure of native vegetation that can host all those ecosystem services that farming itself needs. And finally, we need to stabilize the agriculture frontier. We need to stop converting nature into agriculture. So that's what we need to do on the production side, and a lot of farmers are already doing it on the ground. The problem is that this cannot really happen at the scale that we need without a massive reduction in demand. Otherwise, we get into the argument where whenever you try to do something a bit better here, you will displace it there. Now, the margins for reducing demand are gigantic. We have a huge overconsumption in Europe and in most of the world of meat and dairy products. We could have healthier diets while using a lot less land. We are wasting huge amounts of land on bioenergy, entirely policy and subsidy is driven. Again, if we stop that lunacy, we could release a lot of land that would release the pressure on biodiversity and on the climate. And we are wasting a lot of food to the tune of a quarter to a third of the food that is being produced is never actually eaten. And again, the scopes for improving it are there. So we need really a revolution in the way we produce, but also a revolution in the way we consume, and that's what we are arguing for. Now, the problem is that these profound changes require changes to policies, fundamentally to the way we use subsidies, to the laws we have, to the way that we enforce or rather not enforce the laws. And those changes, for the moment, frankly, are not happening. I will just mention what has been happening in the last 2 weeks in Brussels, where we have seen a cynical misuse by the farm lobby of the terrible Russian invasion of Ukraine to whip up a frenzy of environmental deregulation and attempts to go back to a kind of productivist agenda, saying that we need to produce at all costs, in particular at the cost of nature, while at the same time arguing for the continuation of burning of food and massive subsidies to the livestock sector to ensure a very inefficient use of the food we are producing. So I'm afraid that we are not going in the right direction. And as Janet said, the window of opportunity is closing very rapidly, and we'll all pay a terrible price unless we start changing very fast. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ariel, and further food for thought, if you excuse the pun. I think we shall reflect on your words as we enter into the panel discussion as well. So now I'm delighted to welcome onto the virtual stage, hello and good afternoon, Pekka. Pekka, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chair, and I would like to first thank you for the kind invitation to join you this afternoon. When it comes to biodiversity in agriculture, I think we all can agree that neither can live without the other. Agriculture occupies a major part of land, and agriculture has created its own habitats, for instance, in farming birds. And then this is something that we have also recognized ourselves. It is very much about built up nature. It's about investment of generations of farmers or other, especially rural people that actually have re-escaped and shaped the rural environment that we so much enjoy. We, at least in Koba and Kožeka, we consider biodiversity very much an important element for our future, and it's a precondition to maintain our viable agriculture in the long run. So we need to address this. We have been very supportive to international initiatives, and I welcome Mr. Potočnik's reference to, I think it was the second objective of the principles that he proposed to come up with the international standards all across. We certainly see the value of it. This is very much linked with also, for instance, trade sector and how we believe that international standards would actually help us when it comes to balancing our sustainability needs with international trade and increasing the open market. Parallel to the biodiversity targets, the farming sector must aim at other targets too. Quite recently, we have talked about food security, and on one hand, I'm very happy to see that at least in Europe, we do not go unnourished or undernourished anytime soon, hopefully. But then we see serious consequences to third countries when it comes to their access to affordable food. And so therefore, the food security is very much on the agenda, and it is increasingly also the case for European Union itself. For us, it may actually be volatility of the market, differences in prices, and some people considering some foodstuffs be out of their reach. And that consequently would lead to political unrest, and most probably also government policies changing. We talk about food security, but we also talk about alleviating the environmental impact originating not only from agriculture, but such as climate change, its mitigation measures. From the farming sector own perspective, we talk about economic survival of the European family farming model. It is a dynamic model. It is a model where farming families that may have survived 30, 40, 50 years ago may not be able to do that anymore because of the changing economic environment in particular. Based on the most recent experiences from the COVID-19 pandemic, overall cost crisis, and unfortunately, quite lately, Russian military action in Ukraine, destabilizing international agriculture and food markets, it is of paramount importance to combine sufficient agricultural output with sustainability improvements. And I repeat that, we need to combine sufficient agricultural output with sustainability improvements. We can talk about some progressive thinking in terms of how we produce, and especially what do we produce and how we consume. But the consumers are fundamentally conservative, and the changes are not very quick. We support those changes, and for instance, we have supported for the development of organic sector. We feel that it is a fundamentally important part of European agriculture. But it is important also to maintain its economic viability, to motivate those people who actually put their investments into this sector. And this is something that most of the other stakeholders have actually missed. Quite recently, we talked to some of our colleagues about unfair trading practices, and I was so pleased to see some of the stakeholders joining this EU initiative to make sure that the farmers are rightly rewarded from their efforts, and especially in sectors such as organic. But why do we have private labels? Why do we have price-based campaigning on organic food? Because it is a very dynamic market out there, and people do not like to pay more for their food. We have abundant supply of cheap raw materials. In fact, the real prices for farm gate prices for farmers have declined over the years. And if we didn't have the famous 2009 and 10 hiccup to the international agricultural commodity market, we would be touching the baseline, zero line, sometime around 2030. How sustainable is it if the price of agricultural commodity, in principle, is close to zero? How can we motivate those who actually are supposed to produce this in a more sustainable manner? And while we are interested in enhancing biodiversity objectives, how does this translate into farming survival language? What can we do in an economically viable way that actually the market increasingly would be reporting our efforts? It is clear for us that EU taxpayers' support in the CAP will be declining. In return to this lower real-term expenditure, European farmers must do more. The income element of the CAP is declining, thus putting pressure on the market-based revenue in order to maintain one's competitiveness and especially motivating our young. And this has to be done once again in more competitive trading environment where real returns and the margins on the farm gate prices have collapsed. But what I would expect from the EU biodiversity policy, as much as from other relevant policy areas, is a framework how to develop a market-based long-term investment plan on diverse agriculture adapted to local natural conditions. And the EU natural strategic plans may be a start, but it certainly is not yet enough. We need to address this. We need to develop in concrete terms tools, also technologies, more balanced value chain, and policy coherence in order to make this work. Biodiversity targets and their performance and their success is not going to happen in a bottle or in a bubble. It has to be accompanied by other policy initiatives, and more importantly for us from farming community, it also needs to make economic sense for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Pekka. We shall no doubt come back to many of the points that you raised. And before we do, and before we start the panel, last but certainly not least, it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Rodrigo Lima onto the virtual stage. Rodrigo, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Noor. It's a pleasure to join this extremely relevant debate. I think we heard from Mrs. Lee the negotiations going on in Geneva this past 2 weeks, and there's a lot of debates and views from parties trying to build upon what would be the global biodiversity framework. And it's a common challenge. It's a multilateral challenge that needs to involve all the countries, all the parties towards building upon what would be the next targets for biodiversity. And I would start with the war is complex, and we are unfortunately passing through a war again, and I cannot start without mentioning the war versus food security and how to achieve food security in a moment like this. And then I would quote the 4 pillars of food security that are availability of food, access to food, utilization of food, and stability of the other pillars. And in this sense, in my perspective, the global biodiversity framework, it's extremely relevant when it comes to the sustainable use of biodiversity targets that are being negotiated. We have the 3 main pillars of the CBD, the goals: conservation, sustainable use, and access and benefit sharing. Okay, there's a lot of knowledge and experience related to the 3 targets, but it looks like that what the CBD is passing through right now is to put the biodiversity agenda in a level equal to climate change, because the world needs to face the biodiversity loss and all of the challenges related to biodiversity, and agree what is sustainable use. It will be extremely important, especially because and in my view, this is one of the key challenges of the negotiation, is that the CBD will agree, the parties will agree on the global biodiversity framework with the sustainable use targets, but the targets are not simply to the parties. The targets must include the private sector, society in a broad view, and all the stakeholders aim at adopting good practices, implementing technologies, moving policies towards a more friendly manner, because otherwise we will, in the next 10 years, look to the global biodiversity framework and say, oh, some of the targets were achieved, some don't, because are not just the countries that are supposed to implement the targets. And when we are discussing agriculture and how to move and transform agriculture to towards biodiversity positive and not negative, we need to have the private sector and society as a whole engage into those the implementation of those targets. And then I believe we need to look to the whole, to the different countries and comprehend and agree that each country has different challenges, has different climates, has different technological developments, has different capacities in terms of accessing money to adopt some practices or subsidies from the government, and having this understanding of the different challenges, realities, and needs of the countries. I think we need to have in mind when we are negotiating this sustainable use of biodiversity targets when it comes to agriculture. I think it is very reasonable to argue that there's no single recipe towards what is sustainable agriculture. We for sure can have very concrete indicators to that should be agreed by the CBD parties, and this is ongoing and for sure will be agreed up to Kunming. But then we need to allow parties to implement the targets and to engage the sectors and to create policies aiming to move forward when it comes to what is sustainable production. Because without innovation, there's no possibility of any agricultural system to move forward and on a positive path. And to try to picture this, I think we need to be much more inclusive with small farmers, with indigenous peoples and local communities doing agriculture. We need to engage smallholders, especially smallholders. In Brazil, we have a huge challenge to include smallholders into producing chains and into accessing credit, not subsidies, because subsidies in Brazil is too low, but are low. So to include different types of agriculture into the adoption of technology innovation, so they can produce reducing impacts, they can produce more using less land and resources. They can have, we have a second crop in Brazil, in some cases 3 crops in the same year. So there's the whole debate at the CBD if intensification of agriculture is good or no, and in my view, and in the case of Brazil, it is good for sure, because we can do two or 3 crops in the same year, and the challenge is it's what innovation can allow to the different countries to build upon what is sustainable agriculture, because otherwise we will get to one type of agriculture that is desirable, and all the countries must follow this recipe, and this is not feasible for the whole world. Just and to mention one answer, because this is not feasible, because each country has different climates and challenges when it comes to producing. So in my view, and I'm finishing, the CBD really needs to get to another level with the global biodiversity framework, and how to achieve this, engaging the private sector, the society in a broader scope towards promoting what is sustainable connected to biodiversity, because we need to tackle food security, and we need to tackle biodiversity loss, we need to tackle climate change, and how the CBD targets could support this transformation in agriculture, considering the different countries, their realities and needs and challenges. Thanks.
Thank you, Rodrigo. So without any further ado, I'm going to invite all of you panelists to join me back on the virtual stage here. And what we'll do is we'll start by asking you all to reflect on those two questions that Mrs. Lee left us to consider, and I'll recap those. And whilst I do that, I shall also invite you, the audience, to begin thinking about what questions you would like to put to the panel. Let me invite you as the audience to submit those. You're welcome to do so using the chat function, and we will do our best to try to address as many of the audience questions as possible. So if I have everybody back here, let me remind you the questions that Mrs. Lee posed to you all. She asked, what would be the critical challenges for regions or countries to implement targets relating to sustainable agriculture that would transform the food and agricultural sector towards a sustainable pathway? So what would be the most critical challenges in your view? And I'll invite you all to keep your answers quite brief and to the point so we can get through them. And perhaps at the same time, add a thought on, secondly, what would be needed in order to enable that transformation? So what are the challenges and how can we address them? Yanis, perhaps I could start with you. I'm sure you've been giving this some thought.
Sure, I can repeat what I have said for my introduction. So, critical challenges are available data, lack of space planning, lack of agreed international standards, lack of value chain transparency, and absence of valuing nature. So, without that, how? So I don't see, so this is actually systemic approach. So it's not looking either from a consumer side, it's not looking from a producer side. We all have to accommodate, sorry, we have a mess which we have to clear, and we have to accommodate that we clear that mess. But of course, we need a grid kind of direction in which to go. So I would be, by the way, the first one who understands that, and we see today that food security is an essential issue. And of course, everybody is entitled to have, should have the access to food and all the 4 principles which are there, or water, because it's essential ingredient for our life. But it should not be our concern only when effects are coming due to our irrational behavior, when this irrational behavior hits us, like we see from many things which were connected in the last time with our lives. So, but it should actually be our concern before, so to avoid irrational behavior causing all the side effects and to avoid these security-related problems. Because we hear the security problems now from everybody, from those who are in metal industry, from those who are providing the energy. But where were we when we talked about energy, saving the energy? Where were we? Because we are talking about that for many years, and now suddenly it's becoming an important issue because we don't have other way to go. So I firmly believe that the major human challenge is that we acquire the things. So we believe that when we got used to something, this is our acquired right. And we, of course, maximize our own quality of life and don't really care too much for what will be happening with the others, not to mention the famous word of future generations, or what will be happening to the rest of the nature. We are simply self-centered, and everybody is approaching to those things in that way. But if we want to really fix the things which we have to fix, much more of listening to each other, much more collaboration, and much more common sense and system-based approach will be needed.
Thank you, Yanis. Ariel, do you agree with that? If we followed Yanis's advice, would we get to where we need to be? You mentioned a few other factors, including the changes to consumers' diets and other factors as well. Can I invite you to come in on that?
Yeah, I fully agree. I fully agree. The problem is the politics. I mean, the reality is that PETA's organization has been relentlessly lobbying against all the policy changes that we would need to do in order to go in that direction. And when I hear talks about, food security, by the way, complaining about the fact that we need to produce more because of food security, and about the fact that the price of commodities is going to zero because intensification puts so much product on the market, there's an incoherence there. But I'll just give you a couple of numbers, just stay with me. About the equivalent of 50% of Ukrainian wheat exports is the wheat we are wasting in the EU, throwing into the trash. About 20% of Ukrainian wheat exports we are burning. We are subsidizing people to just burn wheat for ethanol. The European Commission has just authorized farmers, under push from the farm lobby, to plow up the very last scrap of nature that they were supposed to keep under the CAP, in theory, to free up 4 million hectares of land, if they find the water and the fertilizer and so on, which is almost half, well, it's about half of what you could free with a 5 to 10 to 15% reduction in meat and dairy production, which would still leave Europe as a net exporter of meat and dairy. Instead, what we have seen is the EU food security package has been dumping a huge amount of new subsidies on the livestock sector, de facto paying European pork farmers to compete with those people in the poor people in the Middle East and North Africa, who are the ones who are risking starving, because we are putting the extra money not on the side of those people who need to buy pitas, but on the side of people who would feed the cereals to the pigs in order to export high value pork for the middle classes who are eating too much pork, not too little. So we are today actively promoting hunger, and we are actively promoting the destruction of biodiversity. Now, the question is, do we want to change those policies, or don't we want to change those policies? The rest is all nice, blah, blah, but that's the real question. And it's not just in Europe, it's also elsewhere. I have been listening to Brazilian colleagues promising for more than 15 years that the real miracles in agricultural productivity in Brazil will stop deforestation. Meanwhile, we've seen something like 26 million hectares of primary humid rainforest, many more million hectares of savannas being converted. It's already disrupting rain patterns in Brazil. There is a risk of Brazilian agriculture collapsing because of all of this deforestation. And last year, deforestation has been spiking up like hell because the Brazilian government is actively promoting deforestation.
Okay, so Ariel, we're gonna come back to that, but because you mentioned Pekka's organization there at the start, I'm gonna do him the courtesy of inviting him to comment on that. Pekka, do you recognize what Ariel is saying? Do you recognize the figures that he mentioned, for example, about food waste on the wheat with Ukraine? Is this an issue that we need to address, and should that take greater priority in policy making?
Well, it's already in the EU policymaking, and we welcome this. It is, I think, more fundamental to accept the fact that we are talking about systems. It's about how we produce food in the EU as a whole. And most of these changes that we have seen are actually European Union initiated policies, especially when it comes to renewables, when it comes to international trade. We have had successive commissioners who have actually called us to make most of it and embrace the international trade. And we are very good as agri-food chain. We're very good at that, and we are the biggest supplier of net surplus in our trade balance in the European Union. We shouldn't diminish that, the importance of that. And most of that foodstuff actually is much more sustainable, so much more sustainably produced than most of our competitors have, to be very blunt. And in this respect, we are looking into the EU policies to enable us to do the necessary, whatever the political initiative is. And first, if we take a look into the questions, when we talk about a driver, it is very much about the value chain. At the moment, we, as farming lobby, farming sector, doesn't get sufficient remuneration of the agricultural commodities that we put to the marketplace. Most of the farmers produce agricultural commodities. Most of the processing and marketing takes place in other parts of the value chain, which we appreciate. We're very much a part of the chain. And the common denominator for us is that we have to increase our productivity. There's no way that we can produce food in a wasteful manner, and that's why we are so committed to the technologies. Because the more we can produce with less land, in general, it's better for the environment too. Because we would not have to be wasteful when it comes to agricultural land use. And secondly, if you look at the activities of our organization as such, we have been very much defending the model of European family farming. And I come from family farm myself, and I would be very pleased to see some of my children to take over the farm and produce food. And they are actually studying this sector, and therefore I'm hugely motivated to come up with measures that actually can, like I said, like Mr. Potočnik said, that exactly what he said in his opening remarks. I also pointed out that we have to combine our sufficient output to the sustainability needs. And it is the market who decides out there. It is not the farmers. And I think this is hugely naive thinking that it is the farmers who dictate what is going to happen, because we have been deliberately exposed to the market forces by the union and the relevant policies that we see. So let's wake up and see what happens in the real world.
Okay, well, let me stick with you for a moment then, Pekka, because I think it would be remiss of me, since you mentioned EU policies and you also mentioned this notion of European family farming. There are some in the audience who will have heard that the unexpected delay of last week's nature restoration law was to some extent because of the concerns that your industry has put on the table about food security, and it was due to be and we hope still will be a landmark policy of the European Green Deal. And yet, as you know well, the policy-making process here, that piece of legislation would unlikely be coming into force into the official journal for at least 2 years. So the current crisis on Ukraine, we appreciate, is bringing the topic of food security to the fore. But do you, as an industry, and very much supporting the notion of family farming, do you support the nature restoration law?
Well, it's more about the details. And if you look at the crisis itself, actually, it is not black and white for any of us here in the panel. If you look at the consequences of the Russian invasion to Ukraine, which is a hugely unfortunate humanitarian crisis, and I believe that we all agree to oppose it. But then if you look at the consequences of that, we have to accept the fact that it is going to be a diverse set of, let's say, secondary impacts. And then for one thing, we could argue that this would actually push for more to the green transition. And there's a very strong argument for that. We all want to go away from the Russian energy dependency and from agriculture sector, both energy, meaning diesel fuel, possibly natural gas, plus fertilizers. We do not like this. But this is exactly what we'd expect that the European Union would also enable us to develop alternative methods of how to address this, because people do not stop eating. And therefore, we need to use the opportunity also to sustain our supply to the food market while we consider the options how to do this more sustainably. And the key element that is the new kid in the block is that we are politically responsible for the neighboring regions, such as North Africa, Egypt, and Middle East, when it comes to their affordable access to food. Last time we didn't consider this important. We had Arab Spring, and it created a huge political consequences to the EU member states and some governments. So let's wake up and see the reality that we need to come up with sustainability initiatives, but we need to do this in a very competitive environment where people simply expect that they will be having good quality, nutritious, affordable food. If we don't deliver that, there will be no common agricultural policy or no other relevant policies. We will start seeing a dismantling of the union policies in this respect. Member states' governments are acting on their own already. You saw that as a consequence of the Russian embargo or the Russian action. Hungary came up with an idea of limiting new contracts for their exports. This happens in the EU. So we need to recognize that some of these member states' governments would have, in their eyes at least, a legitimate right to limit their, especially exports, because they want to support their food supply to their own citizens. And if I was a government official, I would be very careful not to risk that, because I would be fundamentally responsible for the electorate.
Thank you, Pekka. Well, as a former government official yourself, but looking to another on the audience here, Yannis, listening carefully there to Pekka's response, do you buy that? You know, is that the picture as you see it?
No, I'm just 2 comments. More or less, I agree with things which Pekka is saying. My major, I think that at the end of the day, the things which we are facing will lead us to more sustainable solutions, from a simple fact which I'm preaching already for decades now in Europe, that Europe is terribly import dependent when it comes to energy, when it comes to resources, when it comes to food sources. So if somebody is so vulnerable like we are, then it only makes sense that you do the things which are connected more with such activities like circular economy and reverting the whole logic of the story. My only question, which is related to that, is why we need such kind of crisis as we are facing, that we move. Because it was obvious that we could do all those things before, and to move in that direction without, if there would not be obviously some reluctance and also resistance that those things would happen. And the second comment, it's on standards and patterns. One thing where I think we have to be honest via the rest of the world is that the standards and behavior patterns which are linked to the current economic model were actually set by high-income countries. So I think we are thus bound to show that we are willing and capable to change the reality we have created and to lead these transitional efforts.
Thank you, Yannis. Pekka, you've got your hand up. I'm going to come to you in a moment because we've got a question from the audience that I think relates directly to that. So it's nice timing to bring that in now. Somebody in the audience asked that both Ariel and Pekka, you've both mentioned that we need lower demand of unsustainable foods in order to shift towards more sustainable diets. So it seems like something that you do agree on there. And the audience member says the EU used to have dairy ceilings. Instead of waiting for lower demand, how can governments play a role in lowering supply of unsustainable food products in order to move more quickly to sustainable alternatives? So I'll invite you, Pekka, since you had your hand up, to come in on that, and then I'll perhaps turn to Rodrigo and Ariel.
In response to this question, I just a quick glance through them. Let's talk about what the European Union stands for. We are not a food aid organization as European Union as a whole. This is a trade bloc, and the fundamental element there is free trade and enhancing single market and performance of trade to redistribute wealth across the continent. And one particular example is actually dairy, and I come from dairy sector and I did my studies in dairy, so I know this very, very well myself. Is that if we talk about introducing ceilings once again, this would go fundamentally against the principles of the European Union itself. We have to recognize this, because then the reason why we had to get rid of the quotas at the end was that we could no longer restrict imports to the extent that the quota regime could have been sufficiently efficient in maintaining supply of milk at the reasonable price levels. I know this intimately in my own family income level. My parents were dairy farmers, and I work for the dairy cooperative, and so we know perfectly well what the consequences of the quota was, and then the kind of the EU role in redistributing wealth. And once European Union adopted policies where we went for more liberal trade agenda. I'm not saying that it is by definition bad, but once we adopted this, there was a break-even point when we had to realize that the quota regime in this case, for instance, did no longer work in the way that it was intended to. So it did not give the benefits to the sector that we were looking for. And until the Russian embargo, in fact, once again, we actually managed to solve this, and also beyond that, because we had reasonably good demand for the dairy products, which meant that we had some opportunities for the dairy producers out there. And so we have to refer to the EU relevant policies and the fact that we are there to benefit from the freer economy of the Union. So if we go the other way around, we can talk about it, but then please be aware that there will be consequences on this. And I'm not quite sure whether the society is prepared to face them.
Okay, well, sticking with that question, since the audience asked it, Rodrigo, let me bring you in. Do you agree? You talked yourself, you said, biodiversity targets must include all of us, including farmers, if they're agreed internationally. Do you agree with what Pekka is saying?
I totally agree, because if the biodiversity targets would exclude and not try to bring to the importance of producing more sustainably, we will end up at a multilateral fora like the CBD say that Yanis, it's good, and Pekka is not good, and Lee, it's more or less or something. We have the knowledge, we have the science to say that biodiversity loss, deforestation is a key driver of biodiversity loss. So deforestation is a huge issue, and we need to manage this, right? And in Brazil, we are totally aware of this. But what if there's no deforestation anymore? What is at stake when it comes to sustainable production? Biofuels in Brazil, for example, renewable energy, it's something that I think every country is willing and looking for. And in Brazil's perspective, if there's no biofuels from sugarcane, from maize, now there's a program for biomethane using byproducts, and if we don't use this, we will use what? Petrol, we will use gasoline and diesel. So I don't see how the CBD as an international treaty would bring countries and the private sector and all the stakeholders in aiming to implement positive measures. If there's one recipe saying that this is the way forward, and you're out, so you're not at the CBD agenda. You're totally at the CBD agenda, because we are talking about what is sustainable use. Consumption is something very important. Reducing loss, totally extremely important. But how to achieve a balance between what must be done towards promoting sustainable production when it comes to biodiversity? I think if the goal at the end in Kunming simply says that monoculture is not good, just agroecology is good, we will lose the opportunity to engage all relevant stakeholders into an implementation agenda to drive transformational changes when it comes to sustainable agriculture.
Thank you. I want to turn the topic to a question to a topic that Yanis raised earlier about the role of nature-based solutions. And whilst I do that, I see there are some more questions from the audience, and you as panelists are also invited to where they're directed to you, address them directly. But keeping the focus, Yanis, you mentioned that nature-based solutions have a critical role and harnessing nature's regenerative capacity is key here. I just wondered if you'd like to elaborate on that, and as that seems to be a thread that could potentially unify, some of the views that we've heard here. What is needed by policymakers to scale up, as you mentioned, the challenge of nature-based solutions?
Nature-based solutions are, I would say, no-brainer, because they are the cheapest, and the nature is anyway providing us with a lot of practically with a lot of answers which it's practically not, we don't pay the cost for that, so it's not accounting for that, what it's doing for us. And what we have to take care is actually to keep the capacity of the nature, that it can provide us with those solutions, which are to a large extent there for free. And maybe one thing which I would add in this debate is that we are currently in a very intense preparation of the Global Resource Outlook, which is a kind of comprehensive document, which we try to put every 4 years on the table of International Resource Panel. And we have firmly decided that we will switch our approach and philosophy. So we are switching from the logic of maximizing the output of producers and output of the sectors to maximizing human needs. So we want to look to the provisioning systems like food system, like mobility system, like housing system, like rest of consumer goods systems, which are resource intensive, because the only thing which you have to be aware, climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, are the reasons of resource over intensive use. So the thing which we need to achieve at the end is use less virgin resources, or we will, or all we discuss, it's pretty much redundant, because we will never meet them. So, and we have, on the other hand, creating quite resource intensive economic systems. So, but if you want to focus on provisioning systems, on human needs rather than on outputs, of course, then what stands in your way, it's actually GDP and all the things which are connected to that. So you need to look it through the well-being logic and not through the GDP logic. And we are also in IRP entirely switching from the GDP to the well-being logic, because we have to be aware that following the GDP logic is leading us somewhere. And this compass, which is leading us somewhere, it's simply not right compass for the sustainability. And it is a crucial question. But all nature-based solutions are simply part of that systemic approach and picture, which we try to build and defend.
Thank you, Yannis. Let me ask Pekka, there, you heard Yannis say nature-based solutions are free. And if we look at it from an even economic perspective, the advantages are clear. Can I ask, what are your members' views on the role of nature-based solutions? Is this an area where we can unite stakeholders to work together to scale up the role of nature-based solutions and involve the farmers, in your view?
Well, first of all, I should ask how do you define nature-based solutions? But if you refer to for instance, technologies that are based on the natural systems, or for instance, in combating pest and disease, we are of course very much interested in this, and we in fact have been promoting EU authorization to use these technologies much more widely than we have been able to do so far. We see an important alternative available there. But then the European Union has been extremely slow in authorizing these. For instance, in concrete terms, I talk about low-risk substances, biocontrol measures, for instance, which we consider a quite useful tool, especially for certain sectors such as fruit and vegetable. They are more complicated in some other sectors where we need to find another method to combat some of the phenomena that we consider unfavorable to our production role. Linking also some of the measures to, for instance, more diverse environment is actually quite welcome. But once again, it all boils down what we can do economically, and especially when we talk about the famous structural change in the EU agriculture. The whole idea has been over the decades, to increase our output and productive agriculture, by all means. This was a fundamental part of the European Union. Now we need to change this thinking, and it's not going to happen overnight. The performance that we have now in place took like 50 to 60 years to come through. Now, what happens is that we need to employ new technologies, new thinking in much quicker pace. And this is what we have been calling for quite many years. We have been consistent in pointing out, for instance, that we need to be able to produce in a more sustainable manner. And we were ridiculed in Europe to say that, well, we don't have a food security problem. Yes, we have, because the consumers do not like price volatility. If the prices go through the roof, well, by this I mean 15, 20, 30% increase at the consumer end, we don't see that price increases in the farm gate prices. It's mostly taken over by the other stakeholders in the value chain. So when the argument is that the agriculture and especially farmers somehow dictate the market by producing cheaply, I don't find that very intelligently sustainable thinking. So that's what we have been calling for. Give us the market powers also to a certain extent that we can actually rebalance the market value chain, and we can actually be more transparent on who gets what. And then, especially with the modern technologies outside the scope of agriculture, like digital agenda, we would be very much interested in developing mechanisms, systems that actually would enable the consumers to be certain of the products they consume. Where does it come from? Because fundamentally, some of these technologies provide a valuable assistance to the farmers themselves to make the necessary investment for the sustainability call for the consumers may have. So
Okay.
it may be useful for us, but we need these at the European scale because that's why European Union is there.
Ariel, let me invite you to come in, and then we'll aim to wrap up the discussion. You heard there Pekka, questioning the definitions of nature-based solution, although not challenging the potential to perhaps work together with other stakeholders on this. Is this an area where you see potential for common ground and collaboration?
Well, I'm afraid that what I'm hearing is a lot of denial and fluff, to be honest. By the way, I noticed, Pekka, that you have dodged the question that you've been asked about your opposition to the nature restoration law. So I will try to go a bit more concrete, answering some of the things that have been seen. So what could we do practically, really, now to deal with those problems? So one is we could stop subsidizing fossil fuels. We could stop burning food on a gigantic scale, putting food back on the market tomorrow morning. And to Dr. Lima's question, well, the alternative to it is not oil, it's electrification, with electricity coming from wind and solar. The technologies are there, prices are going down, we could massively accelerate it. So we can do it. We don't do it because some people prefer us to spend a lot of money on burning food. And to give you a taste of that, if we were trying to replace our oil exports from Russia, just the Russian imports, with biofuels, we would need 80% of agricultural land in the EU. That's how little oil you replace with that much land. The second thing we can do is to stop the perverse subsidies, which the EU last week, on your behalf, has been pouring into the livestock sector. Every time we give production subsidies to the livestock sector, we are de facto lowering the price of meat, hence inducing people to eat more meat, and we are de facto increasing the buying power of the livestock sector against the vegetable eaters who tend to be the poorer people. So it's an environmental nightmare, and it's deeply immoral, particularly if you care about North Africa, as you said that you do. The third thing that we could do tomorrow morning is to start enforcing legislation. In the EU, we have quite a lot of nice legislation. It's not being enforced. When we allow people, around Doñana to steal water to grow their strawberries, we are de facto allowing them to outcompete their neighbors who have been law-abiding and paying for the water. So the enemy of the good farmers is not the environmentalist. The enemy of the good farmer is the bad farmer. And at the moment, we are systematically favoring the ones that deplete resources, including the ones that do it illegally. And by doing this, we are also depricing the price. The people that work well cannot get a decent premium because they are constantly being undermined by people who destroy the environment. The fourth thing we could do,
and then I have to ask you to wrap up, please, Ariel,
is green public procurement and waste reductions. We don't have the time to go into it now, but there are things that we could do immediately because, for example, all this myth that it's about the conservative consumers, well, a lot of food is actually not bought by the consumers. It's bought by the state, and the state could start being better tomorrow morning. So there are very, very concrete things that we could do. Of course, we can remain there and talk about in general and say that we all like nature and we all like and we'll keep going down the road with going on, and it doesn't take us to anywhere nice.
Thank you, Ariel. If only we had more time, because I feel like we could carry on for the rest of the afternoon. There are so many topics here to go on, but we are unfortunately out of time. I am an optimist, so I heard actually more than we might think that we have in common. So to that question, do we have common ground for collaboration? I think my answer would be yes, we need to work together and pursue the solutions. But I see Alberto is back with us. So it's my duty to hand us back to Alberto. But before I do, I want to thank you all, each and every one of you, for sharing your views. And I hope to be discussing these topics with you again in the near future. Thank you. And thanks to you, Alberto, and to IUCN. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Noor, and thank you for steering this very, very interesting and rich discussion. I have a terrible challenge to summarize what has been said. I don't think that's actually possible, because what I hear is a lot of key words that actually I would like to highlight, at least some of them, because this is more or less kind of the same words we are listening from everybody in a way. We spoke a lot about system, about the need to change the system. This is not just a small fix here and there. This is a system, a transformation, a transition. And there are a number of words attached to this transformation: subsidies, market, how we produce, waste, demand, standards. It's also very interesting to hear all the time that the stakeholders are mentioned as the important bit of ensuring that we speak with everybody. I think that this is actually what we are trying to contribute with this discussion. I also heard a number of times, and from a number of you mentioned the nature-based solutions. By the way, there is a definition, of course, from 2016 from IUCN, and there is a second one, very recent, from the United Nations that actually is now the moment agreed. It's from everybody, United Nations. But well, this said, I think that we can only think that we can only continue with this stakeholder discussion and to ensure that we have the opportunities to share our views and to try to get ahead as much as we can. As Noor was saying, we need to go towards common ground as fast as possible, actually, because we are not in an easy situation at the moment with several crises. And I would say that actually beyond the discussions, we need to start to move also towards action. We need to start this transition towards sustainable agriculture. As I said, I think that we need a solution at the moment desperately, probably. And in this context, I have two final questions. Actually, Ariel, you have already mentioned a number of things that could be done in future about subsidies and also about implementation or enforcement of legislation. But still, I think it will be very good to hear from your side two very specific points. One of them will be, if you will be in a position to decide and take one measure tomorrow to achieve sustainable agriculture to 2030, what will this measure be? And the second one, probably maybe related with this first one also, what will be your final message to Kunming, to the discussion that is happening at the moment on the global biodiversity framework? And with this, I will pass the word to Janice. If you can summarize this in 1 minute, I understand the challenge, but that's the time we have now.
Yeah, Alberto, it's really a challenge. Just maybe one comment, and I will avoid the first part of the question. On all this search for alternatives, which I'm hearing, I'm not hearing enough the utmost important alternative. So how we would save something, because the system which we have created in consumption and production, it's simply such that is using too much of natural resources. And if we don't fix that, we will have the real problem. So I think we should stop thinking that providing cheap, abundant energy is the final solution to all the problems which we have in the world, because it's not. And please start looking to those questions a bit from different kind of perspectives. It's a long debate, but rather I would not go in now in that direction. But concerning the Kunming, my message would be to focus on strong science-based implementation, which goes beyond conserving the area of biodiversity and really leads to a change in our productive sectors. Of course, it's encouraging to see ambitious targets for protected areas like the famous and well appreciated 30 by 30, but we know that conservation alone will not be enough. Colleagues from IASA have modeled combinations of policy interventions aiming to halt and reverse biodiversity loss, and they showed that unless we use the entire policy toolkit at the same, it's also in the climate story, it will not be possible to slow and reverse the loss of biodiversity we are currently experiencing. So it all comes back to the need to transform the unsustainable natural resource use patterns, and we are back to our economic model.
Thank you very much, Yanis. And I will pose the same question exactly to you, Pekka. So it's about the one measure that you could take tomorrow and about the message to Kunming. Again, if you could summarize it in 1 minute, that would be great.
Well, first of all, we don't dodge anything in our organization, and when it comes to the package last week, in the light of recent developments, it was a reasonable thing for the Commission to postpone it. We need to take a look into the timetable and ambition levels, but we expect that the package will be there, as I indicated in the chat. I think the key answer to us all is to rebalance the value chain. If you expect that the farmers to do better in terms of the sustainability initiatives, that preferably that the consumers would favor, we would expect that we would be also given the opportunity to do this through the value chain. We do not get more money from the taxpayers. We have to get more money and more motivation from the consumers, willing consumers, and especially to motivate our young. This is what is the solution in the long run, and we need desperately those investments into sustainable agriculture, securing supplies of food.
Thank you very much, Pekka. And again, Ariel, the same question you have already answered partially, but maybe you want to go more into the details and also into the Kunming bit of it.
Well, I would start, I'm afraid, with subsidies reform that Pekka and I have been discussing for a generation and is still not happening. And in particular, I think if you are asking about what's the big one, we need a massive reduction of the livestock sector. And this needs to be done in a way that is socially equitable and that works with the farmers and that is sensitive to the biodiversity that depends on pasture, to the local communities that depends on livestock, to all sorts of things. But if we are keeping going toward a world where, the whole global middle class has the very unhealthy diet that the West has gone down, there will just not be enough planet to go. So that's really the big one. In terms of Kunming, what I would want is very clear science-based targets that are measurable and enforceable. Because otherwise we get into the kind of discussions with Dr. Lima about, we shouldn't say that agroecology is good and monoculture is bad. Well, actually monoculture is bad and it's a scientific fact. But let's start measuring things. Then, if we have targets for net biodiversity increase, net water use decrease, net reduction in nitrogen, whatever, then we can measure things. And then, if you can find a monoculture that is good for biodiversity and for soil fertility and all the rest of it, I'm happy with it.
Thank you very much, Ariel. And to conclude, Rodrigo, if you could answer the same two questions about the one measure for tomorrow and about Kunming. Thank you.
Thanks, Alberto. I think my message for tomorrow is that countries should be able to, and I hope that countries are able to agree on the need for different agricultural systems to coexist and to improve. Any system should improve, no matter in what aspects. I think if, and then going to Kunming, if the CBD is not if it is not possible to agree and to engage the private sector, the different sectors, the society, to really implement good practices, to implement technology, to implement actions that will allow to transform how food and feed and renewable energy are produced, we will not success. Again, in my view, there's no one single recipe towards this. And if the idea is to label this is good, this is bad, all of us will lose, and the society will lose thinking about the 2050 vision of living in harmony with nature. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Rodrigo. And actually, I would love to have 1 hour or 2 hours or much more time, because this discussion is extremely interesting. Unfortunately, and with apologies because we went over time a couple of minutes, we need to start to think in closing. And I would like to remind everybody that anyway, the recording is available at the Forum for the Future of Agriculture website. And thanking very much TNC, ELO, the FFA, and all our speakers, and of course the participants today. I would like now to close our event, Global Biodiversity Targets, Which Role for Agriculture? Looking forward to continue this debate. Thank you very much and have a nice evening.